Okay, well, we want to welcome you all to another Extremist Publishing podcast. This is one of the discussions where we talk about the impact that books have had on the lives of their readers, and today we're talking to Director of Extremist Publishing, Tom Christie, who's written most recently on the perception of dementia in popular culture and questions of national identity in Scottish fiction. He's the author of a number of books on cinema and on popular computing, including the films of Linklater and Hughes and Mel Brooks, and genres such as Christmas films and James Bond films. And his interest in early popular computing produced a study of interactive fiction on the Sinclair spectrum, and his time working at the Smith Institute in Stirling produced a 19th century mystery thriller called The Shadow in the Gallery. So he's writing fiction as well as talking about the fiction that's impressed him. Tom is an old student of mine from back in the days in University of Stirling, so we go back quite a few years together. But we're here today to talk about his own tastes and interests in fiction in 5 books that have meant a lot to him. The titles Tom has chosen are Alistair Gray's Lanark, Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange, The Outsider by Albert Camus, Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes, and Paul Auster's New York trilogy. The first thing that strikes me, Tom, about these books is that apart from the Camus in the 1940s, these are all from the second half of the 20th century, ranging from the 60s to the 80s. Is this because this was just when you're coming into serious reading? Was this a rich period for you?
Well, I think that's certainly true. A number of these books I first discovered when I was a teenager, and some of them when I was an undergraduate. So in different ways, they've all come to mean something significant to me, and in many cases, I first encountered them at fairly formative periods.
Yes, only 5? How did you get down to selecting 5 in particular? I see some themes running through them, and we'll get down to that, I'm sure, later. But do you feel there's anything particularly was missed out?
Oh, I mean, it took an age to narrow it down to 5. That's absolutely true. There are so many authors I would like to have mentioned, not least of all one of my literary heroes, Ian Banks, who was made the list and then wasn't, and then was, and then wasn't, as I agonised over who was going to be on this list. So yes, absolutely, it's been a long period of negotiation with my own memories, as it were, until I was able to narrow it down.
I would have thought that at least 3 of these might be called science fiction. 2 of them might be called postmodern fiction. Is that something that you were aware of at the time?
Well, I think there was certainly an interest in postmodernism that ran through my teenage years specifically, as I was learning more about the limits of literature and where they lay in terms of genre and in terms of how these particular categories of fiction are considered by popular culture particularly. So it doesn't surprise me in that sense that some of them would be termed postmodern. In terms of science fiction, yes, that's something else, another genre that has had great personal significance to me over the years. And it's very interesting because, of course, there has been, particularly with titles like A Clockwork Orange, quite vehement debate over how far they could be considered science fiction or speculative fiction.
Yeah, science fiction is a difficult title, isn't it? And most serious writers of science fiction now don't like their work to be referred to in those terms. Speculative fiction is often thought to be more serious. But as an old fan of science fiction myself, when I was a teenager, I've found a certain amount of amusement in seeing how suddenly once despised pulp fiction, science fiction authors like Kurt Vonnegut, for example, who were always very fine writers, suddenly become welcomed into the canon of serious literature.
Absolutely, and I mean that's a path that's been followed by people like Philip K. Dick and many others. Yes. I agree entirely that it's a very healthy thing that these texts, which previously I think would have been considered to belong to slightly out of the way genres, I think things that were aside from the mainstream are now, as you rightly say, receiving far more serious criticism and careful consideration.
Yes, these what Hugh McDermott used to call handrails for Philistines, these definitional categories are never helpful at all, and there was a degree of snobbishness involved in the whole thing too, of course. But now with authors like Banks himself, for example, you mentioned, and David Mitchell, for example, the Cloud Atlas writer, these are now seriously Booker Prize winning, Booker Prize contending books, which once would have been called, with a certain degree of disdain, science fiction. But those days are gone. Tell me about Lanark then. This was a big book, and of course Gray himself doesn't like it being called science fiction. It's not science, he says. Nastler says later in the book, it's magic.
Well, this book will always hold a special significance to me. I first encountered it when I was 16, and it was recommended to me by Jim Geeky, who was my high school English teacher. And it blew me away when I first read this book. The sheer inventiveness of it, the incredible flexibility of the narrative. I mean, it's very difficult to dislike a book where the epilogue turns up 3 or 4 chapters early because it's too important to leave to the end, as Alistair Gray puts it. That interested me. The evocation of post-war Glasgow versus this very dystopian fantasy version of Glasgow interested me, as did the interplay between the two, in the sense that you don't know whether the Duncan Thaw narrative leads directly into the Lanark narrative or whether one is merely a dark reflection of the other. So all of these things I found immensely appealing, and at that particular point in my life, the whole thing seemed very alive and a very energetic read, because it was bringing alive to me a post-war Scotland and a modern Scotland that I hadn't necessarily been all that closely aware of before.
Yes, I think that's right. I remember being excited by Lanark. Roughly the same themes, really. Here was fiction that was entirely contemporary, that was daring, that was moving outside the rather dark, harsh realism of so many other Glasgow novels through the 60s in particular, in the 60s and 70s, rather gloomy novels of decay and dissolution. Not that Gray shies away from these things, he takes it very seriously. But suddenly there was an energy and an imagination and a grasp and a reach, which was really very exciting. 1981, it was an important step in Scottish publishing, I think. I have rated it, along with Eddie Morgan's The Second Life, the key collection of his career, I think, was similarly exciting when it came out. Do you think the two halves stick together, the Lanark and the Thaw? He teases us, doesn't he? They sort of fit, but maybe they don't. Is Thaw really Lanark in the underworld?
Well, it intrigues me that in subsequent interviews, Alistair Gray has mentioned that he wanted to have one heavy book instead of 2 potentially light ones.
Make a bigger splash, he said.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's certainly an element of that, because I very much appreciated the interplay between the two separate narratives, and the fact that, as Gray himself, I'm sure, pointed out on a number of occasions, that it was very much up to the reader as to in what particular order they wanted to read the individual sections in, that he had presented it in a particular way, but that he didn't necessarily expect it to be read in the way that he had suggested, which, as I say, coming at a formative period in my life, it seemed very daring. I mean, this was a kind of stylistic playfulness that I hadn't really encountered before, and I found it very arresting.
I have a special edition of this novel in a box set with 4 hardcover novels where you can organise them in the correct order, and you can read volumes 1, 2, 3, 4 right through, instead of, 3, 2, 1, 4 or whatever. Yeah. I think what struck me about the Unthank narrative is how political it is. The personal life of the young artist Thaw, closely based on Gray's own life, is part of that rather grim realism of Glasgow fiction. But the Unthank section turns into something really quite different. He says, doesn't he, that the Thaw narrative is a man who fails because he doesn't love. He doesn't know how to love, and that the Unthank sequence is about a society that doesn't know how to love. And I think the vision of the Institute, and the vision of institutionalization, and the vision of corporate global capitalism run wild in the Unthank makes it an important novel for its day.
Yeah, as is the case, I think, with the critique of bureaucracy, which I find particularly arresting at that particular point, because looking back, it was such a scathing indictment of, I imagine, that kind of post-war bureaucratic British society that Gray obviously takes exception to. And as you say, contrasting that with globalisation in the sense that this was not necessarily the answer to the problem, but perhaps something that was going to compound the problem. I found it at that point quite interesting, because in a way this was introducing a lot of these themes to me in quite stark ways, because at that point I had no idea as a teenager just the incredible significance of Lanark Gray himself in post-war Scottish literature, and in a way it acted as a gateway to my interest in Scottish literature generally.
That's interesting to hear. Yes, suddenly there was something about our own place and our own voices that was exciting and new.
And I think as well, in combination with people like Ian Banks and Irvine Welsh, suddenly I was reading about an Edinburgh and central Scotland and a Glasgow that suddenly became very real, because up until that point I had been reading a lot of classical literature, and I went through a phase of reading a lot of philosophy in my teenage years, and then suddenly it all became very immediate, because I was reading about in the work of these authors that were situating their fiction within recognisable venues.
You remember what Gray says in the book himself, the notion that a place doesn't really exist until an artist has written about it. And he says, in a way now Glasgow exists in a special literary sense. Although I would say there were plenty other earlier novels that brought Glasgow to our attention very vividly. It's fun though, isn't it? It's hilarious.
It is. And I think that's very interesting, the fact he's able to make such wide-ranging and serious points, be they philosophical or ideological, and still maintains that sense of playfulness.
Talking about authoritarian societies and a failure to love, that maybe brings us to A Clockwork Orange. Tell me about that. How did you come across that?
Well, the high school connection continues with A Clockwork Orange, because that was the novel I based my higher grade review of personal reading on. And it's an intriguing thing, because even now, all these years down the line, the complex moral and ethical issues at the heart of the novel have stayed with me. The questions of whether removing from someone the ability to reason in a moral way somehow robs them of a human element has very much intrigued me, because it's fed into a lot of subsequent debate in popular culture about why crime happens, what is the nature of society, how our culture is influenced by media commentary and so forth, and in a different kind of way in comparison to Lanark, but around about the same time, it was bringing these sort of hard-hitting issues into my consciousness for the first time.
Goes back to Milton and Paradise Lost, really, doesn't it? So that if you're not free to do bad things, then you're not free. Full stop. Yeah. I'm interested. It was a school project. Was there a problem with that? Because it was quite a scandalous book when it first came out, and when the movie came out, there was a lot of scandal. I mean, people were banning it from cinemas and things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Was that an issue when you were at school?
Well, fortunately, the English teacher I had for my hires was a gentleman called David Addison, was very broad-minded and was quite happy to engage with the book in all of its complexity, even though, as you say, it contains quite a lot of violent content and very challenging content. But he was certainly quite happy to allow me to comment on it in a critical way, and to sort of mention the things that had jumped out at me from it. And it's intriguing because at that particular juncture, which would be about 96, the film was still banned. And it stayed that way, of course, until Kubrick died, because it was he who had imposed the ban on the film in the UK. So I first saw the film many years later. I think it was about 2000, 2001 when I first saw it. And that impressed me for entirely different reasons. What particularly amazed me was the way that Kubrick, with all of his trademark visual inventiveness, seemed to recreate so vividly the scenes and the characters and the situations from the novel. Although, of course, there is also the controversy of the fact that he had adapted the American edition of the novel, which omits the final chapter, and consequently leaves it with a rather bleak tone that the British version of the novel omits.
Where Alex settles down, really, in in the British edition. Yeah, Alex's Droogs and the ultra-violence, that was a big issue in the 60s, I remember. There was a lot of anxiety about juvenile delinquency and so on. So this was a hot, I mean, I suppose it's always a hot topic, but it was a particularly hot topic in a relatively staid society that Britain was in the 60s.
Yeah, that's true. And I think what intrigued me about it, apart from the fact that you had this very arresting Nadsat dialect, this teenage argot that was heavily influenced by Russian, which I suppose at the height of the Cold War had a certain subversive element to it anyway. Whereas that was an extraordinarily impressive achievement given how much of it was invented. Yes, I think the uncompromising nature of the violence, which is unflinchingly depicted but never glorified in any way, I found actually quite laudable, because he doesn't shy away from it. He's not in any way coy about depicting those scenes, whilst in interviews since he's often spoken of his distaste of the fact that he had to depict them in the way that he did in order for it to suit the tone of the book.
He knew what he was doing. He wasn't afraid to shock us, because Alex, the protagonist, loves classical music, and he associates classical music and the highs and the drama of classical music directly with violence. That's why he loves it. And so when they cure him of his violence, but it destroys his liking for classical music. Now that's a kind of fairly frightening connection to make. Most classical music enthusiasts wouldn't really want to suggest that we love Beethoven and Sturm und Drang because it's associated with violence.
It's good old Ludwig van, as he puts it. And it's an intriguing thing, actually, because if you fast forward a few years to the production of Die Hard, the film's director, John McTiernan, was very keen to have a Beethoven Ode to Joy motif throughout the film, and Michael Kamen, the composer, held a contrary view and said, please, I'm quite happy to use Wagner or any of these other composers, but please not Beethoven. It just seems like sacrilege.
Yeah. Wagner's okay for Apocalypse Now.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, the next book on your list is The Outsider. This is from 1942, so this is a whole generation earlier, really. The Outsider, L'Étranger, by Albert Camus. Were you at school when you came across this, or was this a student discovery?
It was. I was an undergraduate when I was midway through my undergraduate years when I read The Outsider, and another book that had an enormous impact on me. In a sense, and I think you've suggested this, there is a combination or a contrast to be had with Lanark, in the sense that here we have a protagonist who, for one reason or another, finds it impossible to feel the way that other people do. He has this strange kind of emotional block that makes it quite difficult for him to interact with society in the way that perhaps he should. And as Camus has said subsequently, there is that sense that in some way society has punished him for not playing the game.
He doesn't weep at his mother's funeral, remember, yes. Yeah, it doesn't show enough, it doesn't go through all the required social signals to say how upset he is. What's the opening lines? Mama died today. Or maybe it was yesterday, but it doesn't matter. I mean, worse to that effect.
Yeah.
He's very cool.
Yeah, and that's the intriguing thing, because whereas Alex from A Clockwork Orange is clearly a sociopath, you don't have quite that same sense with The Outsider. There is instead that sense that he simply doesn't feel. There is an amoral quality to him. He's not by any means making a conscious effort to lack morality. I think he's simply functioning the way he knows how. And therein lies the central question: do we condemn him for effectively being himself? Or is there some social aspect to his character that he, through lacking those particular empathetic feelings, through having this singular lack of compassion, should we consider him something other than human? Because obviously, his actions do culminate in a murder.
It's written in a very flat, kind of affectless style. It's very simple. The French is very simple, very flat, affectless, kind of one thing after another, there's no great emotive force in the prose at all. It's simply a long descriptive account of rather idle days in Algiers, and including, as you say, shooting an Arab on the beach for no apparent reason. It's connected with a dispute they had earlier, but really it's not an act of self-defense or an act of revenge. It's an almost meaningless act, which is what Camus after. Do you think there's something wrong with him? Is he a sociopath, if not a psychopath?
Well, that's an interesting question, because there is a sense of complete apathy about him, which intrigues me, because we see in Duncan Thaw and Lanark someone who, as you mentioned, seems to have a failure when it comes to connecting with people on an emotional level, versus Alex Cornish, who simply doesn't care about his impact on other people. What matters to him is the immediate and satisfying his own urges. I think The Outsider presents someone who is midway between the two. Mm-hmm. He's interested in doing his own thing, he's interested in leading his own life, but he seems not so much to have an antipathy towards other people as simply to regard them as background noise.
Isn't what Camus getting at, and isn't what Meursault experiences, a kind of cosmic indifference?
Yes, I think that's very interesting, because I think the second part of the novella brings that very sharply to light, the sense in particular where we see his altercation with the priest about the nature of the human condition, and the fact that the priest kind of suggests vaguely that he may have his death sentence conferred, which is something that's clearly not the case after the altercation, does rather suggest that his actions are being viewed through this very particular and rather inflexible social lens. And that intrigued me, because it seemed to me that Camus was making all these very interesting points about not just one individual who was incapable of interacting with other people in a meaningful way, but perhaps society in general, which to me suggested a kind of Beckett-esque commentary.
Yeah, I think it's more than just a political issue. I think it is a philosophical issue, and this is the great novel of existential absurdity. And I think what Camus is saying is the universe really doesn't care, and whether I act this way or that way under the eye of eternity, it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean, and it's terrifying. So Meursault is free in a way, which makes him scarcely human or superhuman in an odd way. He's just indifferent to what happens to him, and in the end he awaits his death quite happily. Poor old Thaw struggles and fails and tries again and fails. He makes a kind of constant kind of cock-up of his life, but he keeps trying. So he's a recognisable, fallible human being. Alex, as you say, is a psychopath, really, with a love of classical music, who eventually settles down in the way that I suppose bourgeois society in the 1960s hoped that the rockers and the mods and the teddy boys and all the rest of it would settle down and become decent citizens at the end of the day. Yeah. That takes us to Daniel Keyes and Flowers for Algernon. It's years since I've read this book. I remember reading it. This is another story that deals with what it might be to be cured, so to speak, against your will. Yes, tell us about Flowers for Algernon.
Well, I first came to this book in my late teens, and I found it enormously emotionally affecting, to the point I've come back to it in years since. I think it's probably fair to say it's Daniel Keyes' most famous work, arguably his best work. And what really intrigued me was the way in which he had, from his own life experiences, extrapolated this whole issue of what I think is termed in science fiction uplift, this notion of what it means to experience life in a different way, in the sense of this particular character, Charlie Gordon, how he feels about having this drastically altered IQ, where he goes from having an IQ of 68 to an IQ of something like 186, and how that affects him on an intellectual level, but there is this unexpected emotional aspect to this transformation as well, in relation to how he interacts with other people, and how other people relate to him.
Yes, he discovers that sheer brilliant intelligence isn't quite enough. You need to love. I mean, you need to have an empathy for people as well, which is one of the themes in Lanark. And without that, you're not fully human.
And that intrigued me as well, this aspect of the book, which was, what does it mean to suddenly attain expertise or genius in some way? Because most of us go through a long developmental process in any given field where we have to learn and learn and learn.
Step by step.
Yeah, and then suddenly here's this particular character who has a genius intellect kind of dropped on his lap. And what's intriguing in one sense is how he makes use of it and then how he squanders it.
I think it's at least 2 movies. I'm trying to remember what they were. You may remember, on this same theme of someone who wasn't a Mel Gibson movie where he's given a huge boost to his intellect and then it fades. You know, it's a similar theme.
Well, I think Charlie was the one that won the Oscar. I'm sure that was the adaptation, the American cinematic adaptation. And yes, it's intriguing because, of course, it's a book that's had no end of controversy in America. It's actually been banned on a number of occasions, and particularly in high schools. And that interested me as well, actually, because as a work of science fiction, it's very successful. But as a work of human nature, you know, an exploration of what it is that makes the human condition work, I found it's actually more successful in that regard.
Why was it banned, do you think? Was it because it talks, you know, this is a book published in '66, talks fairly bluntly to modern ears about being mentally handicapped, all these words that we're not supposed to use anymore?
Well, I think there's certainly an aspect of that, because I think core to the book, whether it be the short story from which the novel derived or the novel itself, I think there is a very interesting commentary running right the way through as this very potent subtext about how society treats people who have mental disabilities. And there is, I think, a clarion call for a greater sense of common humanity, which runs through the book, which itself is laudable. But I think beyond that, there is a sense of utter heartbreak as we see this character who achieves great intellectual acuity suddenly lose that refinement, but be painfully aware of the fact that it's draining away from him.
It's draining away. Yes, it's like Clockwork Orange. It has its own language, isn't it? It's told in the first person, as a Clockwork Orange is, and it has its. I remember the early chapters. Charlie's spelling is original, to say the least. He doesn't spell correctly, really. So and then gradually, as his brain is altered by the experiments of Professor Namur, he begins to spell correctly.
Yes,
which is quite intriguing.
Yeah. And he does such playful things with syntax and grammar, and as you say, the spelling as well. It's very, very interesting the way that is used to highlight his mental state in both aspects. You know, as he becomes more precise and his grasp of grammar becomes more acute as the novel progresses, and then of course goes back in reverse again. Reading it as I did in my teens and early 20s, it really the interesting aspects of that to me were the fact that, you know, it really showed me the power of prose to bring emotional issues to the fore and to chart the way that the mind works.
It was a little controversial too because of its exploration of sexuality, because Charlie discovers sexuality and enjoys sexuality fairly freely in the course of his journey. And I seem to remember that caused a lot of concern among some readers, perhaps especially in America, and maybe especially for American schools. You mentioned that the book had been controversial.
Yeah, and interesting because these are themes that are picked up with people like Frederick Pohl and Cyril Kornbluth and people like that, and in ways that had been largely ignored around the same time. And yet I think perhaps because of the prominence of Fleurs for Algernon, obviously had won a number of science fiction literary awards at the time, that I think it has become more pronounced as a result.
Well, the last book, or the 3 books really, on your choice, Tom, is the New York trilogy by Paul Auster. These are the most contemporary books, really, written through 85 to 86, these 3 volumes. Do you have a favourite among them?
I think the Locked Room particularly impressed me, which was the closing part of the trilogy.
Yeah.
And it impressed me, as did the rest of the book, actually, because of the whole metafictional aspect of it.
Yeah.
Because City of Glass, the opening part of the trilogy, is so acutely aware or self-aware of the presentation of Paul Auster, the writer, Paul Auster, the character, and so forth, that to close on something that was equally challenging in a slightly different way, while still subverting the hard-boiled detective fiction of people like Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and others, it seemed to me remarkably agile, the way that he approached it. There was a real sense of playfulness and creative verve, actually, which seemed to me very not just interesting, but quite engaging when I first came to the book in my 20s.
Yeah, I think my favourite is probably The City of Glass, just that opening thrill of seeing a detective novel turn into an incredible Chinese box of postmodern boxes within boxes and wheels within wheels. It's almost impossible to describe what's going on, except that William Wilson, or as his real name is, Gwyn, actually meets Paul Auster and is mistaken for Paul Auster, who is thought to be a detective. At one point in the book, actually meets the real Paul Auster, who's demonstrably the real Paul Auster, with his wife and his home and his address and everything, and they chat together, rather than the way that poor old Lanark meets Alistair Gray in the middle of that book.
Yeah, and it intrigues me, actually, because it seems to me to be quite a unique book within Auster's own bibliography. I mean, he's written many remarkable works, to the point that he's often talked about as being a potential Nobel Prize nominee. And yet there is still something about the New York trilogy that seems uniquely fresh, and a definite sense of energy, but also almost excitement at the sheer possibilities that are created by this very postmodern, or some would say post-postmodern approach that he has.
It's a strange story. It doesn't quite make sense in the way that Lanark, if you're only to look at it in realistic terms, doesn't quite make sense. I mean, by comparison, Clockwork Orange, although it's a projected future, speculative future, it is actually realistic, if you see it, I mean, within its own terms. Whereas there are aspects of Lanark that you wonder if this could ever be realistic. And certainly, the New York trilogy, is it magic realism? Is it fantasy? Is it allegory? It becomes a very slippery beast indeed. Peter Stillman, the character he ends up trying to save, Stillman thinks he's going to be killed by his father, is the product of a hideous experiment carried out on him by his father. And I saw a link there with Charlie Gordon and Flowers for Algernon too.
Yeah. And I suppose also even The Wasp Factory with Ian Banks, there's a certain degree of parallel there. And it's intriguing because it is, for all its evocation of a very particular view of New York, this version of New York, I think, that was popularised through the detective writing of the 20s and 30s specifically. It intrigues me just what a human aspect there still is to the book. Because, I mean, it's one of those occasions where everyone appears to be part of a much larger puzzle, but yet, in spite of that, there are still believable characters. And I think that's probably true of the second part of the book, Ghosts, where everyone...
just blue, brown, white.
That's exactly
colours for names.
Yeah. And yet, somehow, a little bit like the Brian Aldiss book, Report on Probability A, which similarly talks about relatively abstract figures, but are given just enough of a human dimension to be believable and engaging. It works on very similar lines.
Yeah, I found myself thinking of Philip Dick and through a scanner darkly. It is a similar sense of kind of paranoia of who's spying on who and who's following whom. And of course, the whole point about detective fiction is the detective is spying and tracking down some kind of perpetrator, which never quite materializes in this particular book. But it's about identity too, isn't it? Because wandering through New York, the city of glass, he loses all sense of who he is. He says you walk through New York and you kind of lose yourself. And that made me think a little bit of The Outsider as well.
Yes.
There's a kind of emptiness at the heart of identity in philosophical terms, I think, which Camus is interested in, which I think Auster is playing with in this book too.
And I think also an interesting commentary on community and society and then the place of the individual within society, which is intriguing because that's something that Auster picked up with again with his screenplay for Smoke, the film starring
Yes, I
Harvey Keitel.
love that movie. Yeah.
So it's intriguing to see that theme being visited at an early stage in his literary career here.
I think I kind of got Auster when I was reading him first, when I realised he was a huge fan of Edgar Allan Poe, and Poe appears frequently in his work and is frequently referred to in this particular trilogy, because for all the very modern sense of loss of identity in the city and postmodern fictional games that he plays with how we read texts and how we understand texts, for all that, it's also just a kind of old-fashioned Gothic mystery. And the pen name that the protagonist chooses, William Wilson, is of course the main character, the protagonist of a Poe story.
Yeah, and I think that's another interesting and often overlooked aspect of the New York trilogy is the fact that he does in very subtle ways run the gamut of different forms of crime fiction, from the hard-boiled thriller in City of Glass through to the locked room mystery.
Yes.
By the end.
Traditional.
Which is very intriguing. Because he has this incredible sense of dexterity that is both traditional and modern, and yet in another sense postmodern.
Yes, and it's the City of Glass in particular has a kind of cool, descriptive tone as well, doesn't it? It sets itself absolutely as a realistic prose description, except that what it's describing becomes increasingly impossible to really believe.
Yes, and that transition is made with great subtlety, which is, I think, why it's so effective.
Yeah. Well, those are our 5 books, Tom, and I think I've seen, and I think we've uncovered a number of links between them, which are really quite intriguing. Again, Auster is so full of intertextual references, and that's, of course, one of the striking things about Lanark as well. It contains everything, including a list of its own plagiarisms, which was such fun. Have you any final thoughts on these 5 books? What they've meant to you?
It's been really interesting to have a look back on them because, as I say, in most cases I came to these books quite early on, and it intrigues me in hindsight to see just how influential each of them have been in their own way. Whether it be the postmodern aspect or whether it be the sort of that issue of where science fiction or speculative fiction crosses into the mainstream. These are all things that have had influence on the way that I write and on the subjects I write about. And that's been true of whether I've been writing about literature or writing about films and popular culture. This sense that perhaps genre is not as monolithic as it may have seemed to me in my earlier years is something that has continued to engage me and make me want to write in greater detail about particular subjects. And I think these books may have kick-started that particular impulse.
I think that's so true. The genre fiction has seriously come into its own in terms of literature. I'm a fan of Robert Louis Stevenson, and his fiction is actually, in its day, was thought to be genre fiction and is now seriously studied as significant modern novels, really. And in the same way, I think, on the other side of Burgess and Gray and Philip Dick and Kurt Vonnegut, We've got Thomas Pynchon, Margaret Atwood, David Mitchell, Ian Banks too, of course, Michael Chabon, Haruki Murakami, who I've been reading a lot of recently. These are all people who've picked up the challenge of moving beyond genre bounds and writing the most intriguing kind of modern fiction.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your choice, and I think we will now sign off and have a cup of coffee.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.